Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of Inner Work for Greater Good. I am Emily with Change Light, the founder and CEO and the creator of the Change Light system, the drawing out process, amazing techniques that are all about healing, as in like permanently, fully, quickly healing inner struggles to accelerate your ability to feel good and do good and shine brighter and make a bigger difference in the world. That is what we're all about. I hope you can see my other episodes, but today, this is what we are talking about. When being kind isn't actually being kind. This one's a tough one. And it might trigger you. I know it triggers me in certain ways. But it's this idea of that when we think that we're being kind, or we have this desire to be kind, or we have parts of us that really want us to be kind and show up and be kind, but really, it's not actually being kind. It's not actually the full definition, or really showing up in what's fully kind. Now, let me explain. How do I explain? I mean, obviously, as usual, this came up for me this past week, or even the past few weeks, just because of some circumstances in my life, or in other people's lives who I know, and where there's this desire to be kind. There's this impulse to be kind. There's this, well, I should be kind. Well, the kind thing to do would be, well, I don't want to be perceived this way or that way. I really should be nice. And nice is another good one. When we want to be nice, or we're trained to be nice. But what often can sometimes happen is that from that desire or impulse, or trigger or whatever, to want to be kind, or think that by doing something is being kind, or think that, well, I got to help this person and this is the right thing to do, that it may not, that sometimes what can end up happening is we are actually being invasive. We are actually being kind to that person, but not kind to ourselves, or we see a certain action as an example of kindness, but it might actually not be kind. It might actually be enabling. There are all kinds of circumstances where that can happen. So, for example, in the past, this was from a long time ago, but I was very close with a family who had, one of the members had a severe disability. And what had actually contributed to his disability was drug addiction. Well, the disability landed him in a wheelchair, completely paralyzed from the neck down. Prior to his accident, he had a severe gambling problem. Well, even after his accident, the gambling problem, that impulse, that need to get that high or whatever that was that caused him to want to gamble and take those kinds of risks, that didn't go away. That stayed. So what ended up happening was, he, even after he was completely, paralyzed, couldn't move his hands, couldn't do really almost anything for himself, the family continued to enable his gambling addiction. And I was talking to the sister at one point, and, she was like, well, yeah, he doesn't have any money anymore because he gambled it all away. And I said, well, how did he gamble it away? And they'd say, she said, well, because, he wanted to talk to his bookie and he wanted to place bets. And mind you, he'd actually had a ton of money because of a settlement he'd gotten because of the accident. So the point is, this was a man who already had a gambling addiction, was then in a wheelchair, couldn't move his arms or legs or anything on his own, but then had a family who was still doing his bidding of placing bets. And what ended up happening was it gambled away all this money. So sorry, that's a little more of the backstory. My point is that she said, well, he wanted to gamble. And so, we make the calls for him. And I said, why did you do that? And he said, well, we couldn't not do it. I mean, it's what he wanted. It's what he wanted. We couldn't stop him from doing it. And I said, yes, you could. Now, this is my opinion. You might have a different opinion. But it was like, you can say no, was my response to her. Now, the fact that they didn't say no is also an example of the dysfunction in their own family and their lack of boundaries. But my point being is, they may have seen it as, well, we're being kind and he can't do it for himself, so we're doing it for him. But what actually ended up happening was he ended up gambling away all the money that was there to take care of him for the rest of his life in his severely disabled state. But that also they were enabling his addiction. They were not setting boundaries. And then it ended up falling on the family then to have to then take care of him more because these monies were gone. So there were all these repercussions from them trying to be good family members and will do it for him because he couldn't do it for himself, and he would beg them and then they would do it. So that may not be the most ideal example, but I just wanted to use an example from the past that really is where you could see that the intentions were entirely good to try to help this member of their family, to take care of him, and to do what he wanted to do because he couldn't do it for himself. But ultimately, in their desire to be kind, it had disastrous consequences financially and for the family. And for him, because basically his gambling addiction had been enabled. That's one example. There can be all other ones, where we want to jump in and help people. And maybe we do. We jump in and help people to try to solve their problems for them. It can be also that we have this desire we think to ourselves, well, I don't really want to do that thing, whatever that thing is. But, it would be a lot nicer of me to do this other thing. So these are basically, these are kind of like three different examples I've come up with, is in when being kind, or we think we're being kind, is not actually kind. The first one is when being kind to someone else is being unkind to ourselves. So that's that example of, well, it would be kind to give this person this thing. It would be kind to take them on this experience. It would be kind to, even though they've mistreated me, I should still be nice to them. And being kind of, still taking care of someone, even though, it's not healthy for ourselves. That's where being kind in our minds might not actually be kind, because then we're not being kind to ourselves. And the bottom line is this, that being kind and that kindness, it's not kind, it's not compassionate, it's not caring if it's unkind and not compassionate and uncaring towards ourselves. So it's a way of including ourselves in that formula, in that picture, that it's not just about the one way, it's also about how it affects us. And that is so incredibly important, especially for those of us who are healers, who are caregivers, who are all focused on other people, especially for women, because a lot of times we're trained into this, and some men are too, in their families of origin. And in society for women, it's always, we got to think about everybody else and not really honor how we feel. So that's where, when it's unkind to you, the second scenario, as I've already kind of described, is when we're enabling, when we're being enablers, when we're enabling someone else to keep doing something that's not good or kind or healthy for them. This is, comes up all the time with, addictions, chemical addictions, drug addictions, alcohol addictions, shopping addictions, whatever. You keep giving money to that child who keeps spending it all and then keeps saying, oh, I don't have any money. Well, we might think, well, I'm being kind and, well, they need the money, but it's not necessarily kind, because it's enabling. And what can end up happening is that we end up denying that other person the very important lessons and experiences that they need to learn that they have the power inside of them to fix the situation, to get past the addiction, whatever it is. And so that's where it's not kind, when it's enabling. And finally, the third sort of scenario that I thought of here is when it's invasive, when we, in our impulse and desire, and I want to be kind, and we jump in there and try to save someone, we rescue, or we try to fix, or whatever. When it's invasive, when it's actually violating that other person's boundaries, when it's violating their sovereignty, or even when it's violating their sense of their own strength and power. And I've had this happen a lot in my life. Sometimes you have someone who's smothering, or even I've been that smothering person. And I knew in my mind that I was doing the right thing, and I thought I was really being kind. But actually what I was doing is over-functioning, smothering, invading, stepping in where I didn't belong. But if you'd asked me at the time, it was my intentions were entirely good. My impulses were entirely noble and valid, and I was trying to make a difference or make a situation better. But actually what can end up happening is you end up making it worse. And even though that may not be your intentions, it's not always about intentions. It's about results, right? It's about what actually happens as a result of our behaviors, right? That's part of the calculation too. So those are the three scenarios I see. When it's unkind to you and you're not setting proper boundaries for yourself or that other person, when it's enabling to that other person and denying them the opportunity to actually learn and grow from whatever struggles they might be having, for example. And when it's invasive, when we are actually violating somebody else's boundaries or their sovereignty, or based on what we think is right or kind of the right kind thing to do. Now, where does this come from? As always, I want to give you some tools to work with. Yeah, I will say that within myself, and then in these other situations, these other people I'm talking about, that there's some kind of trigger inside. There's a trigger, there's a part, there's a part of inside oneself that is creating that impulse, that is creating that inner struggle, that is creating that, like, where it's like, well, on the one hand, you know what you really want to do, but on the other hand, well, but this is the nice thing to do. That's where you got to get real with yourself. And this is what I have to do too, is get real with myself. And I go, what's really going on with me here? And what's fueling that part or those parts of me to cause me to basically be kind in ways that aren't necessarily kind, that causes me to enable bad behaviors, that causes me to, want to jump in, that causes me to deny how I'm actually feeling and what my truth might actually be telling me, because, well, I should be nice. And I'll give you an example of a part that I've been aware of inside of me at times. And it's that part, and I've sort of even given voice to it a little bit, and it's interesting because I've healed it so much, and I've healed so many of those. Let's put it this way. I've had more than one of those parts, but I've healed so many of them that now I don't struggle with it as much anymore. Occasionally it'll pop, but I'll have a part that pops up. But it's basically that voice that goes, well, I don't know, I should. Notice when you've got, that's just one example of a part that can lead us to not honoring the strength of our own truth. And it might be that part that says, well, but you should be nice, or yeah, but and it wants to make excuses and rationalizations. I've done, I think, whole episodes on all of that wants to excuse or rationalize. And that part can actually give us a momentary good feeling, well, I'm being a good person, or I'm being kind. And so that's sometimes what can kind of trick us, frankly, into taking that action that ultimately may not be kind to ourselves, or possibly even to others around us. For example, by allowing someone who's toxic into our environment, by allowing someone who's not healthy, or who is abusive, or who has certain behaviors, and we can say, well, yeah, but they were hurt a lot as a child, or, well, but they have, trauma. Okay, that can be true. They're hurt, they have trauma, they have some toxicity. That does not mean that therefore the kind or the right thing to do is to let them into our space, or even let them around other people we care about. Okay, so that's an example where you might have a part that wants to just, well, but what it can be doing is actually downplaying the strong part of you that says, no, this is not okay. And yes, I know the other person's going to have a reaction, they're going to get hurt, and it's still not okay to let them come around and treat us this way, for example. That's the other thing too, is that we can have that part that I'm sort of losing my train of thought here because something else came up, but that's an example of an inner sort of voice, or a tendency, or an impulse, or a part that really wants us to, that can feel good, that can make us feel good in thinking that we're doing the right thing, or we're being good, or we're being compassionate, or we're being understanding, but that ultimately the results, especially if we've seen this happen too many times, that it's not kind to ourselves. Another sort of part that can feel this way is a part that that is impulsive. That's that impulsive part that can be very invasive, and it's the impulse to jump in and rush in, and that can rationalize our need to do so without stepping back and going, wait a minute, is this the appropriate response? Or wait a minute, am I the person who's supposed to fix this situation? Or wait a minute, am I not allowing space for that other person to figure it out for themselves? Or wait a minute, maybe I haven't even asked them if that's what they want or need from me, right? So when we're violating that person's sovereignty, and this comes up, I think I mentioned this in another situation with narcissism, when I talked about like sort of good, well-intentioned narcissism or whatever. I forgot the name of the episode, but there's something called white savior complex. And it is an unfortunate pattern that happens in a lot of places in our world, where like the white person comes in with the money and with the ideas and with the solutions, and they're going to save this community, or they're going to save this country, or they're going to, you know, with all their great intentions, or maybe it could be with their religion even, they're going to fix this, they're going to save the day. But the problem with this white savior complex and the white knight, you know, literally physically, oftentimes a white person coming in and deciding that they're going to solve the problem, is that it's often done without really deeply considering, well, what does that community want? What do they need? What do they desire? What would help them? Would it help them to put in a water pump or a water sanitation system, or would they rather have the money to be able to buy a truck that delivers the water to their community? I mean, there could be all other kinds of things. So that's an example of where being kind may not actually be kind, may actually be a violation of those other people's wisdom and their sovereignty and their ability to meet their own needs. So that's another one. Anyway, the point is, there are obviously a lot of circumstances where we can think that we're being kind, but we're not actually being kind. I'll give you another example too from my own experience, where when I was involved in 9/11 and I rushed in and I helped people and I was saving lives and I was doing all this stuff, at least that's what they were telling me. And I was being told, I mean, you know, that I was, you know, firefighters and others were saying, you really saved my life. And so I got a real charge and a real jolt out of it. But what ended up happening, speaking of number one, where being kind to others may not be entirely kind to ourselves, is that I ended up burning out and getting extremely sick from that, because I was so depleted. And also I had actually taken on some chemical sensitivities from having been at the Trade Center, which basically forced my body to just, I had to stop. And it was excruciating and it was awful. But my point is that I was in those circumstances where I was really jumping in and I was helping and I was getting all the positive strokes and I was getting the reinforcement that said, yes, this is good. We need you to keep doing this. I ended up being unkind to myself because I pushed too hard. I hurt myself. I burned out. So there's another example of when being kind to others may not always be entirely kind to ourselves. I'm just throwing this up. My shamanic healer, she's amazing, and she teaches a whole thing about boundaries. So she's really taught me a lot about boundaries and what boundaries mean and how to set them and how to recognize them, all of that. And she is so strong and firm and clear in terms of her own boundaries in her life because of the issues she's had with, you know, others in her life. And so she's really taught me a lot about that and helped me realize that your impulse may be perfectly well-intentioned, but it's not necessarily the right one. And so then that, just want to, I don't know, I feel like saying that, like just, and pointing out, and I really realized through following a lot of her work, is that ultimately, the healthiest way we can be is not when our energies are tangled up with other people, but when we are honoring of ourselves and our own energy and what we know is right for us. And in doing so, we can then better and more effectively, less impulsively, more congruently honor what's right for others and be kind in ways that are at the same time kind to ourselves. So it's something to think about. And I hope this has been helpful. As always, I love you. Thank you so much for listening. And please, 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 when I talk about noticing these parts, I teach a whole super easy technique that can help you notice the parts and release them from inside of you to help calm those parts down. And ultimately, if you work with me, we can permanently and fully heal these parts too that are causing you to behave this way or feel this way or have these impulses. All right. So I hope this has been helpful. As always, I'm Emily. Go to changelight.world to learn more about my work. Join the free course and community, community.changelight.world. Listen to my podcast, Dark Light Truth, in which you can hear people heal these parts inside of them. All right. I hope this has been helpful as always, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.